The chandeliers inside the Royal Meridian Hotel shimmered like captured stars, casting a golden glow across tables dressed in crisp white linen and polished silver. Gentle laughter rippled through the grand dining hall. Laughter that sounded elegant but hollow. The kind born from people who had everything, yet found amusement in belittling those who had nothing. At the heart of it all sat Victor Harrington, a man whose wealth dominated headlines and whose arrogance was as vast as his empire. Beside him was Sheikh Rashid, a royal investor from Dubai. Composed and poised, his quiet presence a striking contrast to Victor's loud, showy demeanor. And standing before them, trembling slightly as she clutched a small basket of red and white roses, was a young waitress named Miam. Victor leaned back with a grin that gleamed as sharp as glass. "Sell me these roses in Arabic," he declared, his voice echoing across the room. "And I'll give you $100,000. The laughter that followed was cold and cruel, cutting through the air like a blade. Miam's heart pounded in her chest. Her hands tightened around the handle of the basket. These roses weren't just flowers. They were a favor for the restaurant's owner. A small task for extra tips she desperately needed to send home to her family in Syria. She had come to America 3 years ago after losing everything. Her home, her father, and her future, to the devastation of war. And now, she stood before a man who saw her accent as entertainment. If you believe in kindness, redemption, and second chances, please take a moment to like this video, share, and subscribe to Stories of Kindness. Because what happens next is a reminder that compassion and dignity can change the world. The challenge lingered in the air, cruel and heavy. Miam could have walked away. She could have stayed silent. But something within her refused to shrink beneath mockery. She lifted her head, steadied her breath, and met Victor's amused eyes with quiet defiance. The clinking of glasses stopped. The chatter faded. Even Sheikh Rashid turned his attention toward her. Then, softly but clearly, Miam began to speak. Her voice carried a melody of courage. Ashtari hedi al, warda bi, hubanwa amal, lai, anaha tukatabu al-kalb kabul and tablug al-akal. Buy these roses with love and hope, she translated, her tone calm and poetic. For they speak to the heart before they reach the mind. The room fell into absolute silence. Victor's grin faded. Sheikh Rashid's eyes widened with respect. He understood every word, every delicate note wrapped in grace and sorrow. The roses trembled in Miam's hands, not from fear, but from the weight of her story carried in her voice. When she finished, the chandeliers seemed to stop swaying. The hall, once alive with laughter, now held its breath. Victor sat motionless, his arrogance replaced by something he had long forgotten. Humility. It wasn't her fluency that stunned him. It was her dignity, her quiet strength. He had expected broken English and embarrassment. Instead, he had been given a lesson in humanity. Sheikh Rashid rose slowly, placing a hand over his heart in a gesture of deep respect. "Your words," he said softly, "carry the soul of a poet." Victor's throat tightened. Without a word, he reached for his checkbook, scribbled a figure, and handed it to her. Miam glanced down. Her breath caught. Her 100,000. She looked up, tears welling in disbelief. Victor stood abruptly, his face pale. Without a word, he turned and walked out. His laughter left behind on the polished floor. When the doors closed, Miam stood in silence, still holding her roses. Sheikh Rashid gestured for her to sit, but she shook her head gently. "Thank you, sir," she whispered. "But I cannot accept this. It was never about the money." The sheikh smiled. "Then use it," he said. "Not for yourself, but for others who have lost their voice, as you once did." That night, Miam walked out of the Royal Meridian, clutching the check to her chest. Her reflection glided across the glass doors like a ghost leaving behind its pane. The cool night breeze kissed her face, carrying the faint fragrance of roses. She stopped by a park bench and sat quietly, the city lights mirrored in her tears. Memories flooded back. Explosions tearing through her village, her father's arms shielding her from falling debris. Her mother's whispered prayers through nights of hunger and fear. She had come so far from the dust and despair of war. Yet, it had taken one cruel joke to test the fragility of her dignity. But something in her had changed. Those roses were no longer mere blossoms. They had become symbols of resilience, courage, and rebirth. In the months that followed, Miam used a portion of the money to open a community center for refugee women, offering free language classes, job training, and emotional support. She named it the Garden of Hope. On the wall, she painted her favorite Arabic phrase, "From every thorn, a flower blooms." Years later, fate would bring Victor Harrington back into her life. His company had partnered with the very charity she founded. When he entered the modest center, he recognized her instantly. But Miam was no longer the trembling waitress he once mocked. She stood with confidence, surrounded by women whose laughter carried warmth instead of cruelty. Victor paused at the doorway, his eyes misty. When she turned and met his gaze, he said softly, "You changed me." Miam smiled, calm, steady, radiant. "No, Mr. Harrington," she replied. "You changed yourself the moment you chose to listen instead of laugh." They stood in silence, surrounded by the soft hum of women learning new words in new tongues, their futures unfolding like petals in the sun. What began as mockery ended as redemption. One arrogant challenge had sparked the rebirth of dozens of lives. If this story touched your heart, please like, share, and subscribe to Stories of Kindness. Because every small act of compassion helps us tell more stories that remind the world to listen before judging. Before you go, tell us in the comments, what do you think Miam's story teaches about dignity and kindness? As the music fades and the final image lingers, we see her again. Miam, standing in her blooming garden, roses swaying gently in the wind as she whispers to the air. Every word has power. Every kindness has wings.